Resuming debate, the honourable member Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm always pleased to rise in this House on behalf of the great people of Sturgeon River Parkland to talk about their priorities in this Parliament. Now, after 9 years, the evidence is clear that this NDP Liberal government have proven themselves too costly in terms of crime, taxes, corruption, and just plain incompetence. I'm proud once again to rise in this House to hold this Liberal government to account, to Parliament, to our democracy, to all Canadians for their corruption and incompetence. Now, what we're speaking about here today in this Parliament is about a ruling that the Speaker made that this Liberal government violated an order of the House of Commons by refusing to submit full unredacted evidence for a criminal investigation into a $400 million green slush fund scandal. This ruling, combined with this government's actions, has paralyzed Parliament, preventing focus on issues like the skyrocketing cost of housing, Liberal inflation on food, and the rising rate of crime. What we're dealing with today is an issue of this Liberal government's incompetence and negligence in terms of $400 million of inappropriately diverted money at the Sustainable Development Technology Canada that was funneled into the hands of directors who had a conflict of interest, who had a financial interest in the companies that they were sending taxpayer money to. Now, these directors were directly appointed by this Liberal government. They were accountable to this Liberal government. They were accountable to the Minister of Industry. And this government refused to act while $400 million taxpayer dollars were misappropriated for personal gain. Until the Prime Minister meets our demands to release the full unredacted documents to the RCMP, Parliament will be forced to continue with this very important privilege debate, and they will find no rest. Conservatives will continue to fight tooth and nail to stand up for the rights of Parliament in this House. We will fight tooth and nail to stand up to this government's corruption. We will fight tooth and nail to ensure taxpayers get every single stolen dollar back. Now, what we're talking about here is parliamentary privilege. And for those Canadians who are tuning in who might not understand what parliamentary privilege means, it means that members of the House of Commons have rights. This is a sacred principle that we inherited from the Mother Parliament at Westminster. This Liberal government has violated the rights of Parliament by refusing to release documents that this Parliament demanded. These powers to call for documents are rooted in the very Constitution of this country of 1867 and in the Parliament of Canada Act. This issue is so significant that the Speaker has had to rule on it, and we've been debating this for weeks in the House to the exclusion of all other issues because this government continues to paralyze Parliament and refuse to hand over the documents that Parliament has requested. Now, if this government thinks that it has a mandate from Canadians to refuse to hand over documents that Parliament has demanded, they must take it to a higher power, the people of Canada, so that they can get a mandate to withhold these documents. They do not have that mandate. They do not have the courage to call an election. And so that's why we're here today with a paralyzed Parliament. Now, the Liberals have claimed that they can't release these documents because they're going to infringe on charter rights. Well, it's a very novel argument. This is an appeal to ignorance, as they say. It might infringe on rights, so we must withhold it, without offering any clear or concrete evidence to back up this claim. What I say, Madam Speaker, is that the Charter was created to protect Canadians from the excesses and evils of government, not to protect government from accountability from Canadians and Canada's Parliament. These redacted documents that were provided were heavily redacted, censored, and blacked out. This level of secrecy in a country like Canada and a country anywhere across the world is wrong. It's preventing us from holding this government to account for the way they spend our money. Now, it is Parliament that has the authority to spend taxpayers' money. It is Parliament, those hard-fought privileges that were fought for in the 1600s and the 1700s in the British Parliament that we have inherited here in Canada's Parliament. Those were very hot. These were literally wars fought over the rights of Parliament to raise money and to spend money and to hold government to account. In fact, there was a king who was actually killed because he refused to submit to the will of Parliament. That is how serious a precedent this is, and that's why the Speaker has had to make a ruling that Parliament's rights were violated. Now, before this matter can go to committee, we have to insist that the RCMP and Parliament have full access to the information that we have called for. This issue deserves to be handled with the utmost seriousness, and it needs to be put as a priority for this Parliament. Now, all opposition parties agree, except for these Liberals, that this demand must be met. These Liberals don't have a majority. They don't have the right to defy the will of this House. They don't have the votes to defy the will of this House. So if they want to get a mandate to defy the will of this House, they need to take it to the Canadian people, something that they refuse to do, because I think they know exactly what's going to happen if they ask Canadians if they support their move to withhold these documents, and it's not going to look pretty for them. This is a scandal that reflects on all the Liberal scandals that we've seen over 9 years of this NDP Liberal government. Now, why is the government working so hard to hide these documents? Well, when we're talking about $400 million, this isn't chump change. As Canadians are facing a cost of living crisis across this country, it's more important than ever that we ensure that every single taxpayer dollar is spent rightly, efficiently, and that goes to the best possible result for Canadians. Canadians need to hold this government to account in the next election, but while this government refuses to call an election, it is up to this Parliament to hold them to account. While the ballot box might be the ultimate judge, this government refuses to let us go to the ballot box, so we're going to keep fighting tooth and nail until they give Canadians the documents that they deserve. Now, we're in an affordability crisis, and the Liberals are acting exactly the opposite way that Canadians would expect a government to act, especially a government that they only gave a minority, a government that they expect to work with other parties in this House, not defy the will of this Parliament. Instead of discussing ways and finding ways to serve Canadians, we're having to sit here and discuss this government's negligence, their incompetence, and their ongoing corruption and refusal to be transparent and hand over documents about their mismanagement. According to 2024 100-count report, food banks have recorded over 2 million visits this past March, and more than a quarter of those visits were by children. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, when we're discussing these things today, because this government has paralyzed Parliament, it's removing our ability to discuss these very important issues about how we can deal and bring results for Canadians. And while this government holds this Parliament hostage by preventing these documents from going forward, we can't deal with the very important issues that Canadians want to deal with. Now, getting back to the issue of STDC, the industry minister is the main perpetrator of this scandal. He violated a House order. And I want to go back to a document that this Prime Minister released back in 2015 when they first formed government. In 2015, the Prime Minister sent each cabinet minister a letter, and it was titled Open and Accountable Government, outlined their responsibilities. I want to quote from this document here today. Quote, "To be worthy of Canadians' trust, we must always act with integrity. This is not merely a matter of adopting the right rules or of ensuring technical compliance with those rules. As ministers, you and your staff must uphold the highest standards of honesty and impartiality, and both the performance of your official duties and the arrangement of your private affairs should bear the closest public scrutiny. This is an obligation that is not fully discharged by simply acting within the law." In another section, it says, "The trust of Canadians will also rest on the accountability of our government. In our system, the highest manifestation of democratic accountability is the forum of Parliament." Doesn't sound like the government of today. They don't really think that the forum of Parliament is the authority in this country. Quote, "You are accountable to Parliament for the exercise of the powers, duties, and functions with which you have been entrusted. This requires you to be present in Parliament to answer honestly and accurately about your areas of responsibility, to take corrective action as appropriate to address problems that may arise in your portfolios, to correct any inadvertent errors in answering to Parliament at the earliest opportunity, and to work with parliamentary colleagues of all political persuasions in a respectful and constructive manner." You know, we've come a long way since 2015, and I doubt that this government would put a letter to cabinet ministers today with a straight face, because that's not the NDP Liberal government that we've been seeing over this past 9 years. I further quote, "Ministers must answer to Parliament's questions on how public monies were spent, as well as to account for that use. Whether a minister has discharged responsibilities appropriately is a matter of political judgment by Parliament. The Prime Minister has the prerogative to reaffirm support for that minister or to ask for his or her resignation." I want to quote again, public monies, ministers must answer to Parliament's questions on how public monies were spent, as well as to account for that use. This government is refusing to hand over documents about how $400 million of taxpayer money under the industry minister's portfolio were misdirected to insiders, some insiders who are very, very close to this Liberal government, including a Liberal environment minister who still holds shares in one of the companies that received at least $10 million through this program. A program that the Liberal environment minister, before he became the environment minister, was a very effective lobbyist for. This is insider. This is Liberal cronies at the trough with taxpayer Now, the Prime Minister, it says here, has the prerogative to reaffirm support for that minister or to ask for his or her resignation. I just want to think about the past history of Liberal ministers who have resigned in this government, and it seems like the only ministers that this Prime Minister's ever asked for their resignation or ever forced to resign have been the ministers that have stood up to him. Why is it only the ministers that stand up to this Prime Minister that are asked to resign? It's not the ministers who misplaced $400 million of taxpayer money because they weren't holding their board of directors accountable under conflict of interest rules. Conflict of interest rules that these ministers fully knew were being violated. In fact, members of the board even raised the conflict of interest rules to the industry minister at the time, and it was ignored. They knew full well that there was conflict of interest going on, and they did nothing to prevent it from happening. And now $400 million has been misspent. Why is it that the Minister of Industry is not being held to account for this mismanagement? It just doesn't appear that mismanagement or negligence is really a cause for firing in this Liberal government. The only thing that's a cause for firing in this Liberal government is standing up to the boss. Well, Parliament is all about standing up to the powerful. It's all about standing up against the sort of obscurity, the sort of opaque government that refuses to hand over documents and be fully truthful and honest about how things went down and who got rich and how they were connected. No, those things, you know, if you can cover up those things, you can be in cabinet. But if you stand up, let's say if there's a scandal related to a company that's facing prosecution and you're facing pressure from a Prime Minister and a PMO that's calling for you to intervene in an active investigation by asking a special prosecutor to give a deferred prosecution agreement. No, you can't do that. You're out of cabinet. But if you allow $400 million of taxpayer money to be misspent, there's no consequences. I ask, has this government met its own standards of integrity and accountability? Well, as outlined in this 2015 document, I think it's very clear to all Canadians that they have not. Canadians don't expect perfection. They know that governments are going to fail and mistakes are going to be made. But they do expect accountability. They expect openness, honesty, transparency, and they expect that the trust that they put in this House and in this government is going to be respected. I know there's many Liberal MPs in that caucus who agree with this. And I encourage them to have the courage, like the ministers that this Prime Minister fired for standing up to him, to stand up to this Prime Minister and to this government for their mismanagement. Because unless we get more members of this House to stand up to this Liberal government's mismanagement, their negligence and their corruption, we're not going to get any results until we have an election. Now, when we talk about this debate today, it brings up another issue from the past, the sponsorship scandal. Now, the sponsorship scandal involved over $40 million and led to the collapse of the Liberal government at the time. This green slush fund is a $400 million scandal. I know inflation's bad under these Liberals, but it certainly hasn't gone up 1,000%. The cost of Liberal corruption inflation appears to be about 1,000%. While it's $40 million back in the 90s and 2000s, now it's $400 million today. Inflation. The Auditor General found that the Green Slush Fund violated conflict of interest laws 186 times. The Liberals also showed massive indifference during the $56 million and change Arrive scam scandal, when we had developers who came forward and said they could have done this for a fraction of the cost, less than $1 million. Right. And yet we had these sole source contracts, these backdoor contracts going towards a company, and they weren't actually even making the app. It was all being fed to subcontractors. And really, this is what we've seen after 9 years of this Liberal government, is that we're not able to do the kind of things that we used to be able to do in this country. We have to contract it out to somebody else, who they can't even do it. They're a middleman. And they have to subcontract it to the actual people who do the things. And when we have all these multiple levels of contracting and subcontracting, the costs keep going up. And people know that this Liberal government's not watching the cash register. They don't care how much money is going out. And so very quickly, something that should have cost less than $1 million is costing $56 million. That's the cost of Liberal inflation, Liberal negligence, and Liberal mismanagement. You know, we have a Prime Minister who doesn't seem to think that the rules apply to him. We saw this back when he traveled to a private island, despite conflict of interest and ethics rules showing that taking private planes and going to islands owned by private interests was wrong. In fact, there's even some very interesting revelations that have been made years later about how people in the Prime Minister's office didn't even know that the Prime Minister was going to be going. They begged, when they did find out, they begged him not to go, but nobody was going to convince the Prime Minister not to go on that bleep trip. Those are the words. I'm not going to say them in the House. But that's this Prime Minister's arrogance, Madam Speaker. He wasn't going to be dissuaded from something that he wanted. And, you know, people look at leadership and they say, what's our leader doing? And when they see what the Prime Minister of Canada is doing, it gives them an opportunity, it gives them the license to do the same. And so it's no surprise under this Liberal government that we've seen cabinet ministers, when they were in the private sector between elections, allegedly claiming that they had Indigenous heritage in order to try to score lucrative government contracts. We had ministers appointing their friends to boards where they would have a massive conflict of interest, in this case where hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money was being misdirected to companies where there were conflicts of interest. It's this Prime Minister's leadership, and it's filtered down into this cabinet. And the fact is, as this Prime Minister has set a precedent, he's made it very clear that if you do what I say, if you cover up, if you deny, and keep pushing forward and do whatever I say, you will be protected. You will still be in cabinet. But if you stand up to what I'm doing, if you say I'm wrong, you're out of cabinet. You're out of cabinet. And that's what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould. That's what happened with Jane Philpott. They stood up to this Prime Minister and they suffered the consequences. And that message has been heard loud and clear in the Liberal Party. It's why they have to ask permission to even stand up to the mic and speak in their caucus meetings. It's why they have to beg to even have the opportunity to have a secret ballot in this country. I mean, secret ballot is a fundamental basis of our modern democracy, and you're not even allowed to have those things inside the Liberal caucus. Now, we had whistleblower testimony, and they said they think that this current government is more interested in protecting themselves than they are from letting this public nightmare continue. They'd rather protect the wrongdoers and the financial management than have to deal with situations like SDTC and the public sphere. Another whistleblower quote, "It's one thing to say nothing has been found as of yet, but that obfuscates from the fact that nothing has been looked into for that matter." Now, Conservatives applaud these whistleblowers who stand up for Canadians, unlike these Liberals. It should be the Liberals going to the department and asking the questions and finding the truth and saying, this is what happened, here's who's responsible, here's how we're holding them accountable, and this is what we're going to do to make sure this never happens again. But they're preventing us from doing that. They're withholding these documents. And they say, well, the RCMP says they don't want the documents. Well, if the RCMP doesn't want the documents, they can send them. They can send them, and the RCMP can do whatever they want with them. They can use them, they cannot use them. But the fact that this government seems so eager to defy the will of Parliament to prevent these documents from seeing the light of day, it's really suspicious, isn't it?
Highly suspicious.
Why is this? Why are they working so? Why are they burning weeks of parliamentary time on this privilege debate, all to prevent these documents from seeing the light of day? They say, you know, the RCMP says, you know, they might use it, they might not use it.
Sorry, I have a point of order. Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
I greatly regret interrupting the proceedings, Madam Speaker, but I think if you look for quorum, there isn't sufficient quorum, and we should take care of that.
I will double check on that right now. The Honourable Member for the Young Parliamentary Secretary also has a point of order.
Madam Speaker, there were members of the Conservative Party behind the curtains. Do they count as part of the quorum?
Sorry, what was that?
There were members of Conservative Party behind the curtain. Does that include part of quorum?
Sorry.
They're in the chamber.
We will check. We will check to see if there's quorum in the House, and I'll get back to you in a second.
There is not.
How many people online?
We have 19 in total, including
Okay.
I know.
Okay. So we're going to ring the bells.
It was good. It was so good that your police did not want you to get all the limelight.
13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, there's quorum now.
I just kind of look at it, but I say my own.
Yeah, we do have quorum. We do have quorum now. The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland has 1 minute and 17 seconds left.
1 minute, Madam Speaker. Well, it's not going to take me much of a minute to outline what Canadians already know, is that this government is too costly, they're too corrupt to be trusted to continue governing this country. Madam Speaker, we need a carbon tax election. We need an election to deal with this government's corruption and this government's waste. This Liberal government is undermining our democracy. Throughout this scandal, this Conservative Party has fought to uphold our democratic principles in this House, principles like the supremacy of Parliament. This government is undermining our democracy. They're disrespecting Canadians. They're disrespecting the House of Commons by refusing to hand over documents that this Parliament has demanded. The Speaker of the House of Commons himself, who came from the Liberal caucus, who has ruled that Parliament's highest authority has ordered the Prime Minister to hand over these documents, and yet this order has been defied. This is parties across the House have voted to have these documents. This isn't just Conservatives going after the Liberals. This is what Canadians want to see. They want to see these documents handed over. This government has broken their trust with Canadians, and after months they still refuse to comply with the will of this House. If this government doesn't want to comply with the will of this House, it's time to take it to a higher power, take it to the Canadian people so they can get a mandate. They're not going to get a mandate, so let's get to an election right now. Thank you, Madam Speaker.